Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This is climate news for November 15, 2019. There's a huge amount of fake climate news out there, and I want to cover as much of it as I can. So I'm going to keep each story fairly brief and not go into as much detail as I normally do. National Geographic says that all the cold air in the south is caused by an overheated, melting Arctic. This comes after decades of predicting the demise of winter and winter sports. It isn't clear how the same air which is melting the Arctic is causing Texas to freeze. But 40 years ago, when it was very cold in the deep south and it snowed in Miami, National Geographic blamed all the cold weather on global cooling instead of global warming. In today's article, National Geographic says a wavier jet stream brings cold Arctic air down south. That may be a counterintuitive result of climate change, some scientists say. And in 1977, the National Geographic Society blamed the same wavier jet stream on global cooling instead of on global warming. I can remember a time when I thought National Geographic was a serious magazine. But maybe I just like the pictures of the island girls. Meanwhile, over in the UK, the global hunger strike starts on Monday to coincide with the beginning of the election rebellion. It symbolizes our collective vulnerability in the face of the climate crisis. But meanwhile, back in the real world, NASA is reporting that Earth is getting much greener due to human activity. Next story is that climate change is making children sick. But Oxford University's Our World in Data website shows that the number of child deaths has plummeted over the last 30 years since carbon dioxide went over 350 parts per million. Climate alarmists are saying that kids can't breathe because of climate change. But Oxford University reports that childhood deaths from lower respiratory infections have dropped by more than 50% over the last 30 years since carbon dioxide hit 350 parts per million. And then NBC News jumps into the ring. Floods in Venice, fires in Australia, and plague in China, all blamed on climate change. In yesterday's edition, I went over the floods in Venice and showed how the flood in 1825 was much worse than the current flood and that floods in Venice happen all the time. Meanwhile, the drought and fires in Australia are pretty easy to explain. This is the most recent NOAA sea surface temperature anomaly map for the whole world. You can see that Australia and most of the southern hemisphere has anomalously cold water, which is marked as blue. The waters around most of Australia are very cold. And look at all that cold water around the Great Barrier Reef. Not a lot of coral bleaching going on there right now. Cold sea surface temperatures means less evaporation, less precipitation, and more drought. If the oceans actually were warming, as climate alarmists claim, Australia would probably be getting a lot more rain. The worst bushfires in Australia occurred during the Little Ice Age on February 6, 1851. Black Thursday, probably one of the most terrible days of which there is any record in Australian annals, was Thursday, the 6th of February, 1851, commonly known as Black Thursday. We find it recorded that as early as 7 or 8 in the morning at Melbourne, the thermometer stood at 117 degrees in the shade. From early morning, the intense heat was accompanied by a hot wind, almost of the strength of a hurricane, and throughout the day the surface of the country was exposed to the full power of its withering influence. Bushfires raged across hundreds of miles of country, sweeping along with almost the rapidity of lightning and destroying nearly instantaneously men, women, and children, crops and homesteads, fences and gardens, and vast quantities of cattle, sheep, horses, pigs, and fowls. From the whole land arose a cry of utter desolation. Men who woke that morning thriving and prosperous farmers lay down at night without a farthing in the world or any resource left them but manual labor. About half of Victoria burned that day. Melbourne started the day at 117 degrees in the shade. CO2 levels were very low, and this was during the Little Ice Age. Blaming the droughts and fires in Australia on global warming simply isn't going to fly. And in China, a couple of cases of plague were blamed on global warming. But during the Little Ice Age, plague killed most of the people in Europe. When I was growing up in New Mexico during the Ice Age scare of the 1970s, we had about 5 or 6 plague deaths every year. Plague has nothing to do with global warming or the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's a bacteria carried by insects on rodents. One thing which definitely does resemble the Little Ice Age is the deep level of superstition of climate alarmists. 16th century climate alarmists said that witches cooked up bad weather. Tens of thousands of witches were burned at the stake for the crime of weather cooking. But times have changed. Climate alarmists are more sophisticated now. They don't blame witches for bad weather. They blame Donald Trump, Republicans, and climate skeptics. And these very silly, superstitious people believe that they represent science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.